Okay, welcome to our Safeguarding Matters virtually live briefing this morning. We are hoping that you will all enjoy the session and that you'll get something out of it. It's a very, very varied session this morning, and it's so great to see so many people from across the Leicestershire and Rutland partnership. Just to say that we've got people from both that provide services both for adults and children, and it's an opportunity. Perhaps some of this is going to be more relevant to you than other bits of it, but it is the opportunity for everyone to hear what's going on in the world of safeguarding. And whilst some of the things we talk about may not be relevant in your or feel they're relevant in your professional life, I'm sure there'll be some things of interest that in your for you in your personal life as you're with your family. So my name's Helen Pearson, and I'm one of the partnership board officers for the Leicestershire and Rutland Safeguarding Children's Partnership and Safeguarding Adults Board. And I'm going to be if you like, sort of emceeing, as my colleague Gary calls it. So I shall be hopefully trying to move things on, and hopefully we won't have too many glitches, although you never know with technology, do you? So I'm also joined by some colleagues from across the partnership. We work together as a team across Leicestershire and Rutland between our Safeguarding Children's Partnerships and our Safeguarding Adults Board. So I'm joined by Gary, who's one of my colleagues from Leicestershire and Rutland, Joe Reed, who's my equivalent in the Leicester City Safeguarding Adults Board, Liz Dunn and Daria, who some people will know from the learning and development events and things that they put in Safeguarding Children learning and development opportunities. But we do work very much together across children and adults. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. So form, and we really urge you to fill that in, because if we need your email, we need to be able to send you these slides and a link to the recording. So it is really important that you fill out an evaluation form, and perhaps if there's a few of you watching this together, if you could perhaps nominate one person to that we can send the link to, that would be great. Okay, moving on. So we've got a very busy session, including a presentation on safe sleeping, learning from Safeguarding Adults audits. We have a presentation on the myth of invisible men, children's procedures, hidden harm, and fire safety, hoarding and fire care. So we've got a really mixed programme. So hopefully people will feel able to stay for all of it, but if you do have to dip out, then that's fine too. You will also need a pen and paper at some point round about 10:10, because we've got an exercise for you to do. So moving on, very briefly, the role of the Safeguarding Children's Partnership and the Safeguarding Adults Board. So obviously the members are made up of people from the statutory, independent and voluntary sector, and we work in partnership, as I've said, to provide strategic leadership to ensure that there are coordinated and effective working relationships and working arrangements to safeguard children and safeguard adults. And how we do this is through the reviews that we undertake, through audits, through developing procedure and guidance, for developing training and tools to support practice, engagement activities and communications activities as well. So if you want more information on the work of the respective boards and partnerships, there are links on this slide which you will get, which will take you through to the websites for more information. Safeguarding Matters. Hopefully people are aware of our publication called Safeguarding Matters, and you know, we intend to do some additions, you know, like I've got on the screen here, and then some of these live events as well. So just keep your eyes out. If you want to be put on the mailing list for Safeguarding Matters, then there is an email on this slide too. Okay, so I think we'll start. Is Dr. Armitage there?
Hi, yes, I'm here. Can you hear me all right?
I can, yes, that's great. Okay. Thank you. Okay, so Susie, I will hand over to you. If you want me to move the slides on, I'm happy to do that, and just do a Chris Whitty and next slide, please, and that'll be fine.
Great, thanks, Helen. So yeah, that's lovely. So hello everyone. I'm Susie Armitage. I'm the designated doctor for child death for Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland, which rates among one of the worst job titles, I think. But I work alongside the Child Death Overview panel, carrying out the statutory child death reviews. And one of our sort of ongoing learning themes is around safer sleeping. So this is a talk about safer sleeping for babies in LLR and how we can help families to ensure their babies are sleeping safely. As a bit of a trigger warning, obviously it does cover the topic of infant death, and if that's something that is a bit tricky for you at the moment, feel free please to dip out, and we should be done by 10 o'clock, just to mention that. So the purpose of child death reviews is to look at why children die, to look to see if we can identify any contributory factors, whether any of those might be modifiable, so we can do something about them to prevent future child deaths. And we try and capture learning, share that learning, and pick up any actions we need to take from cases. We look at all child deaths of any child of any gestation up to the age of 17 years, 364 days resident in LLR. Next slide, please. So we work looking at child deaths that are expected. We also look at child deaths which are unexpected, and in those cases we carry out something called a joint agency response, and we follow guidance issued by the Royal College of Pathologists and Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health to look in a multi-agency way to try and understand why a child has died. And this is a quote from the guidance, and I think this kind of sort of sets the tone for everything that follows, that whenever an infant dies, it is a tragedy, first and foremost for the infant and the family, but also for all those who knew the infant and family, including those professionals who may have worked with them, and for society as a whole. Next slide, please. So in terms of sudden infant deaths, we know that the number of babies dying unexpectedly has fallen markedly over the last 30 years, and a lot of that is due to work carried out by Professor Pete Fleming and others, understanding that positioning of babies to sleep is really important, and the Back to Sleep campaign that came in, and that caused a dramatic drop in the number of babies dying unexpectedly and with no clear explanation for their death. And you can see from the chart how the numbers have fallen over time. Across England and Wales in 2020, there were still 150 babies who died, and in spite of extensive investigation, which would include a full post-mortem examination, the cause of their deaths remain unexplained. What we do know is that safer sleep practices can reduce the risk of sudden infant death syndrome, and can also reduce the risk of accidental suffocation of infants during sleep. So in terms of what those numbers mean for us locally, we review on average around 70 cases per year. And when we looked at our data from 2016 through to 2022, we noted that we recorded an unsafe sleeping as a modifiable factor in 16 infant deaths. So that's where unsafe sleeping was felt to have contributed, not necessarily caused, but contributed to the death of a baby. That unsafe sleeping was potentially modifiable. There's something we could do differently in future, which might prevent this occurring for other children. And in 10 of these 16 cases, we noted.
You've muted yourself, Susan.
Sorry, I was trying to. Okay. So in 10 of this.
Susan, you've muted yourself again.
I think it's other people muting all.
Someone
Can't
is muting me.
Yeah.
It's muted again.
You're on mute again, Susan. Sorry.
It's not me. Someone is muting me. Sorry. Can you hear me now? Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So I don't know how much of the last bit you had. We looked at 16, so we identified 16 cases over 6 years where unsafe sleeping was thought to be a modifiable factor, and unsafe co-sleeping in particularly was something we picked up. Next slide, please. So in terms of risk from unsafe sleeping, we know that there are certain things that raise the risk for babies, and that they are more at risk of sudden unexplained death. We know that unsafe sleeping positions increase your risk, so that's where the Back to Sleep campaign was key in making sure that babies are put on their backs to sleep and not on their sides or their front. We know that if parents smoke, that can increase the risk. We know that if the sleep environment is unsafe, that can increase the risk, and we're talking about unsafe co-sleeping, so not co-sleeping per se, but co-sleeping with additional risk factors, which is known to be unsafe. But if babies are overwrapped and too warm, that can increase the risk. If babies are sleeping on very soft sleep surfaces, that increases the risk. If there is parental alcohol or drug use, particularly around the time of co-sleeping, which would constitute unsafe co-sleeping, but also in terms of background risk factors, we know that those babies seem to be at increased risk. If there's a history of poor antenatal attendance or late booking, or if a baby was born preterm, so before 37 weeks gestation, or if they're a low birth weight, so that's less than 2.5 kilos, those babies are also at increased risk. There are certain things that have been identified in the literature that reduce the risk and make things safer. So room sharing when sleeping with parents or carers for the first 6 months is known to reduce the risk. Breastfeeding is known to reduce the risk. Dummy use during sleep is known to reduce the risk, and babies who are immunised, fully immunised, they seem to be at reduced risk. So none of these things cause SIDS, cause these unexplained deaths, but they are associations, and we see that pattern there in the research. Next slide, please. So you can also look at these risk factors in a slightly different way, which might be more familiar to some people, using this sort of common assessment framework and thinking about those factors in terms of parenting capacity, in terms of the family and environment, and in terms of the child themselves that could potentially raise the risk for a baby. And as you can see, there are risk factors there that we know increase the risk of harm and poor outcomes for children, not just in relation to risk of sudden death, but for a whole host of other adverse outcomes as well. Next slide, please. So the advice is, and has been for some time, that the safest place to sleep for a baby is on their back, feet to foot, so their feet down the bottom of the cot or Moses basket, with blankets tucked in, on their back, feet to foot, in a cot or Moses basket in the same room as a parent or carer for the first 6 months. So that is the advice that is being given. That is fully evidence-based, and we know that that is the safest place for babies to sleep. Helen, if you could click. However, we know that babies don't read the rule books. Babies sleep here, there and everywhere. We know that family life is complex, and actually trying to follow that guidance to the letter, if you have more than one child, let alone any other sort of vulnerabilities or challenges, is really difficult. And we also know that lots of things influence parent and carer decision making, and not just the advice that health professionals or others give, but there are lots of things that impact on what parents choose to do and how they choose to put their baby down to sleep. Next slide, please. So the Lullaby Trust have developed something called the ABC of Safe Sleep, which is more generic and enables parents to sort of apply the principles to wherever they are and wherever their baby is sleeping. And these are really helpful, sort of memorable things that we can be talking to parents about. So it's really important that you always sleep your baby on their back in a clear cot or sleep space. And it moves away from the Moses basket thing. A lot of babies outgrow their Moses basket by the time they're about 8 weeks old, I think. So it's talking about sleep spaces, and it's always, so it's every sleep, not just the nighttime sleeps, but the daytime sleeps as well. And these are the principles to follow for safer sleep. Next slide, please. These are just a couple of images just to highlight that for parents these days, there is so much out there on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, wherever, these beautiful images of these lovely little curled up snuggly babies, and it all looks very beautiful and pretty. And there is an awful lot out there that promotes a beautiful environment, but that is actually unsafe for sleeping. So it's just being aware of the sort of messages that parents get in their sort of everyday lives, and that sort of saturate their social media experience as well. So we're kind of having to sort of challenge some of that and push back against some of that. Next slide, please. So in terms of evidence-based guidance, this is what health professionals are advised to say to parents. This is the NICE guidance on postnatal care. And it's really important that we're discussing safer practices for bed sharing. So we're no longer saying don't co-sleep. We want to have open conversations with families, acknowledging that some families will choose to co-sleep, and acknowledging that in a lot of cultures around the world, it's completely normal practice to co-sleep. And we know that co-sleeping in and of itself does not increase the risk, but it's about doing it safely, and that there are other factors that can come into play that increase the risk and actually make that unsafe. So discussing safer practices for bed sharing, so making sure that the baby is on their back on a firm flat mattress. Really, really important that parents are advised never to sleep on a sofa or chair with their baby. This increases the risk of sudden death by 50 times. It's really, really risky, and it's really important parents know this. Not to have any pillows or duvets near the baby, and not to have any other children or pets in the bed when sharing with a baby. Next click. And it's important to strongly advise parents not to share a bed with their baby if their baby was low birth weight. So regardless of gestation, if they were under 2.5 kilos when they were born, it's really important parents are advised not to share a bed with their baby if they've had 2 or more units of alcohol. It's a bit like drink driving. The advice is generally, if you've had a drink, don't drive. It's the same with co-sleeping, but certainly more than 2 units of alcohol, it's not safe. If either parent is a smoker, and that's regardless of where the parent smokes, whether it's in the house, outside the house, we know parents will say to us that they smoke outside, and yet we see evidence, unfortunately, on babies who've died that they have been exposed to cigarette smoke. So if either parent smokes, they should be strongly advised not to share a bed with their baby. If either parent has taken medicine, prescription medicine, or over-the-counter medicine that causes drowsiness, or if either parent has used recreational drugs. Next slide, please. Oh, Helen, are you able to move to the next slide?
I have put the next slide on.
Okay.
Safer sleeping and the law.
I shall carry on talking, and then the slides can catch up with us. That's fine. So yes, it's also important to note in terms of the law that that it is actually a criminal offence so the law is that if anyone 16 years or over co-sleeps with a child under the age of 3 years on any surface whilst under the influence of drink or alcohol and causes their death by suffocation, they could be liable to criminal prosecution. And if anyone of any age co-sleeps with a child of any age on any surface whilst under the influence of any drugs, substances or alcohol and causes his or her death by suffocation, they could also be liable to criminal prosecution. So not a lot of people realise that there are some laws around this as well. How those laws are interpreted in practice, there are lots of decisions and things that go into that on a practical level, but that is what the law says. So next slide, please. So we've talked about some of those things that increase the risk for babies. There is one other key thing that has been found to increase the risk for babies, and particularly those babies who are vulnerable, but not just those babies, for all children, all babies. In 2020, the National Safeguarding Panel carried out a review of sudden unexpected death in infancy in families where children were considered at risk of significant harm. So they looked at 40 cases of sudden deaths in infancy and babies who were on child protection plans to look to see whether there were any particular factors or any learning that could come out of that to help us protect these particularly vulnerable babies. And as we've noted before, there are many risk factors for sudden unexpected death in infancy that overlap with those for child abuse and neglect. And what they saw was that there are families where we know there are some predisposing risks or predisposing vulnerabilities. So all those things that we looked at in the triangle, those risk factors that were there. And then on top of that, there were situational risks that happened, or out of routine events. So these are families that were out of their usual routine and some kind of critical incident happened, and then the baby was found unexpectedly deceased. So these are families who are typically living in the context of recognised background risks, so people knew about the risks in the families, but they've had some disruptions to their normal routine, which meant that they were unable to engage effectively with safer sleeping advice. And that included families, for example, who were fleeing domestic violence and staying in a sort of temporary accommodation setting and sort of making do in a very temporary way. Also families who had friends come to stay and were sleeping sort of all over the place in the house in different places to accommodate other people staying, and the routine was different, and what they would usually do for their baby to keep them safe had changed and they did something different. So it's so for families being out of routine, that's something that is kind of being talked about more as a potential risk factor. Next slide, please. So in terms of recognising and responding to these risks, it's really important for all babies sort of universally that we're thinking about prevention and how to help families engage with safer sleeping, and it's really important that it's a sort of conversation-based approach. It's not just a list of do's and don'ts. We know that decision making is really complex, and if there are particular barriers for parents being able to follow the advice, it's really important to explore those. When we're talking to families, it's really important they understand the link between the advice we're giving and why we're giving it. So it's really important not to co-sleep with your baby on a sofa, because if you fall asleep with them there, they might get trapped between you and the side of the sofa, and there's potential for accidental suffocation. So talking through and explaining the mechanisms to help families understand, because then they can use that information and apply it to other circumstances. It's really important we're empowering families with the knowledge of the risks so they can assess their own risks for their own particular baby in their own circumstances, and then they can develop their own plans, and supporting families to develop their own plan for safety at every sleep. And that might include thinking through, you know, if we were going away for a night, what would we do? If I was going out for a drink with some friends and came back, what would I do to make sure that I don't end up with a baby sleeping in bed with me? Wherever I got to put them, how am I going to plan for these things? And it's really important for these vulnerable babies that we know where there are lots of these sort of background risks, that we're taking steps and thinking more about protection than prevention. Early recognition of and response to these vulnerability factors is key. We know the most vulnerable time for babies is in the first sort of 3 to 4 months of life, and for a lot of families, professionals might just be getting to know them. They might not be known to lots of agencies. So if those factors are there, it's really important to sort of recognise those and try and respond to them early on. It's important to think about safer sleeping as part of that broader assessment of risk, and safer sleeping is included within the LLR neglect toolkit, and to think about safer sleeping when we're thinking about safety planning, you know, if particularly if there are limitations on housing or access to appropriate equipment, space, whatever it is, that we're thinking about safer sleeping as part of that safety planning, and including in families where there is known alcohol use, substance misuse as well in either parent. Next slide, please.
Oh, hello, Kerry. Are you all right?
Oh, I think someone's not on mute. Okay. So it's really key. Safer sleeping, I think, is one of these things. We think, well, this is something that the health visitors or the midwives talk to families about. It's really important that we're all talking about it, because lots of us come across families with little babies in various different scenarios. Okay. It's really important that for every baby we're having those curious conversations with families, exploring a bit about where do they put their baby to sleep, are they aware of the advice, are they able to follow it, that they're engaging sleep practices for every sleep, that if there are times where they're going to be out of routine, if it's family events, nights out, if the baby's unwell, if there's an emergency situation, have they got sort of strategies and things they can use? Can they apply the advice even in those situations? It's really important the messaging is consistent. Families always say it's, they get really confused if people come to them saying one thing and the GP says something else, and what do they do? So consistent messaging, and thinking about the wider family, so not just mums, but partners, grandparents, those wider family networks, and not just with the first baby, but with each baby, reiterating that advice, because the sort of environment, family practices, routines change as each new baby comes along, and thinking about embedding support, for embedding safer sleeping and support for those broader family risks and vulnerabilities. We know if we support families in these areas, that reduces the risk of sudden death. It also reduces the risk of other adverse outcomes as well. Breastfeeding promotion, supporting all household members with stopping smoking, cutting down on smoking. If there are housing issues, if it's a case of physical space, that there isn't actually space for the baby to sleep anywhere other than in the parent's bed, thinking about these sorts of things. If a family is known to your service for alcohol use, substance misuse, thinking about that safer sleeping advice, and how you can sort of feed into that for families. And again, families who are struggling with mental health needs or domestic abuse, again, thinking through all those sort of opportunities to reiterate the messaging, and recognising the particular risks that those vulnerabilities might pose. Next slide, please. Oh, that was backwards, I think. Thank you. So in terms of where to go to find out more, there is absolutely loads of really high quality information on the Lullaby Trust website. There is lots on there for families. They have easy read information if you have a family you're working with who have functional illiteracy. If you have families whose first language isn't English, they have information in a multitude of languages about safer sleeping. And for professionals, there is lots of information on there, lots of resources, including, if you're interested, the full evidence base behind the advice as well, and there's lots of all those questions families ask that you kind of think, oh, I don't quite know. Baby sleeping in a sling, or car seats, or pods, or nests, all these kind of things. It's all in there, so it's a great resource for everyone to use. Birmingham have developed some resources around alcohol consumption and parenting supervision, not just for babies but for children as well. They're just short videos that just get the message across to families about thinking, if they've had alcohol, who's looking after the baby, how are we making sure they're safe. There's a fantastic resource aimed more at dads called Lift the Baby, safer sleep advice for dads, and they've got a website as well. The NICE guidance is available online for anyone to look at, and that's what healthcare professionals are engaging families with. If you're working with a family who don't have access to the right equipment to help their baby sleep safely, Baby Basics is a fantastic local charity. You can refer families into there. They provide pre-loved Moses baskets and cots, all safety checked. They have new mattresses that come with them, and all the other equipment that families might need. And as I mentioned, that safer sleeping is included within the LLR neglect toolkit, and that's available online as well through the LLR procedures website. So that brings me to the end of my talk. So I think I'm run over by a few minutes. If there are questions, unfortunately I need to leave now for another meeting, but if anyone has questions, please feel free to send them in, and I'm sure they'll wend their way through to me, and I can more than happy to respond to those. So thank you.
Okay, thanks, Susie. That's really great. Just also to say that we have in the board office developed a 7-minute briefing on safer sleeping, and the link is will be available on this slide when you get it. So the 7-minute briefings are really designed for you to use in whichever way that you would want to, really. Sometimes people find them very useful to use within one-to-ones or supervision or team meetings, but it just gives you some idea of these key messages that Susie has spoken about today. So it brings it all together, and gives you lots of information about where to access further information, as Susie has spoken about. So thank you, Susie. That's great. And yeah, if people have questions, please put them in the chat, and then we can pass them on to you, and then we can make sure that we get answers back to people. So thank you very much.
I can see that Jan's got her hand up, and I'm wondering whether she just wants just to mention as well, we are looking at developing a tool for all practitioners to use to help families with safer sleep. So that is a work in progress, so watch this space. But in terms of resources to help everyone in terms of talking to families about safer sleep, yeah, that is on track. Jan's put her hand down, so I'm hoping that's what she was wanting me to mention. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so moving on. Just again, I'd like to apologise for the technical problems that we've been experiencing. I know that I understand, I don't know, because I can't see, but I understand we've got about 480 people on the call.
511.
511, which is absolutely fantastic. I mean, I'm just blown away. That's great. So I think, you know, the few technical hitches probably is not to be, you know, is to be expected. But thank you for joining us. And as I said earlier, this is very much a blend of safeguarding children stuff and safeguarding adult stuff, and I hope, you know, that you'll find it interesting from a professional and a personal point of view. So we're going to move on to safeguarding adults now, and if you remember the slide that I showed you right at the beginning, which is explain the role of the safeguarding partnerships, and one of those things is that we do audits, we do multi-agency audits. I know that single agencies often do audits of their work, but these are we are very much focused on multi-agency audits, and they're done in the children's world as well as the adult world. And quite often we do audits based on perhaps things that are coming out through case reviews, things that are happening nationally, and we just want to check out how things are working. One of the audits that we did this year, or it might have been the end of last year, was around concerns around abuse within the provider sector, the care sector. And one of the issues that came up was that people were unaware of the escalation procedure. So that's escalation of concerns. You know, if things are becoming more risky, where there are things that are happening that are, you know, increasing the level of risk, but also we're talking about where people, professionals are working together, but you think that perhaps things are not being dealt with in the way that you expected them to be dealt with. So you want to escalate that concern because you feel that perhaps it's got stuck. It needs someone else to have a look at the case, to, you know, put a new eye on it, but also to try and resolve any professional disagreements and misunderstandings there might be. So in safeguarding adults policies and procedures, we have the escalation process, and it is really important that those in the provider sector, well, in all sectors of adult social care, are aware of the escalation process. And what I would suggest, I'm going to try and link on this, and hopefully I don't lose things completely. Can people see that? Can you?
Yes.
Yeah. So this is the escalation part of the safeguarding adults procedures. So it's really important that you familiarise yourself with this. And a good thing to do is probably to print off the flow chart. Come on, open up. Can you see that? I keep checking.
Yes.
Yes.
This is my eyes. So, you know, it's a really good idea. I'm a very visual person, so I quite like a flow chart, and I like, and, you know, when I was based in the office, I'd have little laminated copies of various flow charts around. So I think that's a really good idea. So, yeah, so please familiarise yourself with that guidance. Okay, sorry, you see I've got other things open, so there we go. So back to one of the other issues in the Care Act, section 42 of the Care Act. It is where the local authority has a duty to make inquiries where it is suspected that someone, an adult with care and support needs, has suffered significant harm. For those people in the children's world, this is very similar to the section 47 of the Children Act, where the local authority will investigate where there's reasonable cause to suspect that a child is suffering significant harm. So that's the equivalent. So you've got the Children Act for the children, and you've got the Care Act for safeguarding adults. Safeguarding section 42, and within that procedure for investigating, there is a bit that talks about causing inquiries to be made. Now, the local authority can ask someone else to make inquiries on their behalf. So again, an example would be in a care establishment where there were concerns, safeguarding concerns about an adult in their care, and we may ask, or the local authority, sorry, may ask, if it's appropriate to do so, that they do the investigation or ask the questions because they know the person best. I mean, obviously, if there are concerns, you know, that wouldn't happen if there was concerns about the management. But in a number of situations, it is most appropriate that the care establishment would do a major part of the investigation. It would still be overseen by the local authority, but we call that, and we talk about causing inquiries to be made. So again, it's about making sure you're familiar with the this part of the procedure. So local authorities causing inquiries to be made under section 42 of the Care Act 2014, and it goes into it's a really good guidance actually, and it's to be used by staff who manage or undertake safeguarding adults inquiries under section 42. Okay, and as I say, it gives you an outline of roles and responsibilities. So the roles and responsibilities of the local authority and the roles and responsibility of the organisation identified to undertake the inquiry. So again, please familiarise yourself with these procedures. Okay. Everybody okay? I'm just checking. We got any? Yeah, jolly good. Right, so we're going to do a little bit of an exercise now. And this exercise is called, for your information, LLR, SCP, SAV have designed an exercise. And the purpose of this exercise is to think about the use of acronyms. I don't know about you, but I go to meetings sometimes and it's awash with acronyms when people are talking about their roles and what involvement they've had with a family or an adult, and it can be quite perplexing sometimes. And I remember when I was a social worker and people used to say things like, my very first child protection conferences was, well, the baby, it is fine, well, the baby's above the 3rd centile, and it was like, okay, everybody looked happy in the room, so I thought that must be good, but what does it mean if they're below the 3rd centile? We have shorthands for the things that we do, so it's about terminology and it's about acronyms. And so for 5 minutes, I would like you, using pen and paper, to start to go through this slide and disentangle these acronyms. What do they mean? Okay, so we've got 5 minutes.
Okay, so I'm designated nurse for safeguarding children and adults for the Integrated Care Board, which was the which covers Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland, and Jan Harrison is the other designated nurse for safeguarding children and adults. Next slide, please. Thanks. So this is about a piece of research that was done in 2021 and called Invisible Men, which I'll go into. But what I wanted to say at the outset is that obviously we need to acknowledge that children are still at risk from other people, such as their birth mothers, stepmothers and non-birth partners. So we didn't want to be exclusive about this, but the piece of research was actually about men. But we don't want to be not appropriate about genders here. And it'll be self-explanatory as I go through the slides. Next slide, please. So the myth of invisible men was part of a piece of research by the Child Safeguarding Practice Review Panel, and it was published on the 16th of September, so just over a year ago. Oh, sorry, I keep getting pop-ups over the top of what I'm reading, I'm sorry. So what I wanted to do was just summarise what that research was about. Babies under the age of 1 year are actually subject to more non-accidental injury than other groups of children. So we're talking about very young babies here, and also that most perpetrators are men. And so therefore they're the greatest source of risk to those children, but often they are the men are the people that we know least about. So the study that took place was field work. It was also a literature review, and then psychologists went and spoke to perpetrators in prison who had harmed babies or where the babies had died. And the key questions that the study were asking was, how does the safeguarding system as a whole understand the role of men and the male carer, and how can we be more effective at engaging and accessing men and assessing men? So the cases that they looked at that were eligible with children under the age of 1 year were 92 cases, and the babies had either been injured or killed. And so that was out of a year of cases, and it was 35% of all the cases. And it's interesting to note, because it's worth taking on board, that in 81% of the cases, or the majority of the cases, the babies were living with the birth father. And then those key percentages under there are something that we need to be aware of, that actually just under half of those cases were only known to universal services, so they weren't known to any other services. Only just over a quarter had early help, 13% were children in need, and 12% on a child protection plan. So the cases in the brackets there are the actual physical cases, and then the percentages are to the left. Next slide, please. So key facts in terms of men and male carers, like I've said, men are more likely to be perpetrators, especially with abusive head trauma, and people will know all about the work that's being done with ICON to reduce babies being shaken. The actual birth fathers outnumber the stepfathers, but especially where the children are younger, and that goes back to the 81% actually living with birth fathers at the time of the injury. And also in terms of the children, male babies are more likely to be victims of abuse than female babies. We don't necessarily know why that's the case, but that's the facts in terms of risk. Next slide, please. So in those cases that we're talking about, so as I said before, they're in the brackets there. So 64% domestic abuse was present in the case. 35%, so, you know, over a third, the father had mental health difficulties. Again, a third of the cases, the parents were young parents, and it's a small number but significant that 5 of the cases were care leavers as well. So those 4 risk factors are important to note. Next slide, please. Sorry, I keep getting pop-ups over the top of what I'm reading. So the issues for the male perpetrators, adverse childhood experiences, substance abuse, a normalising of taking drugs, particularly cannabis, I think, and mental health histories. So one of the things that came out of the research, and it actually is quite accessible to read, is that we're probably very well aware in the system of fathers that we know to have had a violent background or have a violent history, but what we don't necessarily know is the finer detail of men that aren't on our radar in terms of what their history was, and joining up that information. So things like difficulties managing anger, ADHD, anxiety and depression, and the ACEs, we might not know about that in terms of the history of the birth father in the cases that we're working with. And also, like I've said, the coexisting domestic abuse and very quickly defaulting into aggression to manage situations. So all of those issues for the male perpetrators. Next slide, please. So the context, and I guess that is even worse in the current climate. So the context in terms of all of those problems and the risks that we were talking about, but again, on top of that, debt and poverty, not in work, racism, the care leavers, like I've already mentioned, and like I said, not necessarily men with a violent history that we know about or a violent history against adults, but violent acts. So outbursts, sudden angry outbursts, and a history of that sort of nature. Next slide, please. So there was no one single indicator that helped people identify risk. It was the challenges coming together, a bit like talking about finances at the moment and the cost of living crisis. Also the history, the type of health, and obviously mental health came up, and then those external pressures. So in a sense, if you haven't met with the father, if you don't know the history and you don't know the detail, you're not going to be able to put all of those factors together that increase the risk. Next slide, please. So in terms of men that had been interviewed and the kind of messages that men were sharing with the interviewer, that's the psychologist that went into prison. Sorry, I'm having to just click on pop-ups. There were men that really wanted to be involved in sharing the difficulties and about being included. But also the men who were less keen to be involved were sort of enabled by the system not to be involved. So it was about filtering that out and understanding how to engage men more effectively. And the other point the research was making is often men aren't specified in key documents. Health visitors aren't trained to work with men. There could be information that GPs have of known risk factors, but they weren't shared. I think the other information to notice, and certainly in cases that I've looked at in detail, sometimes the father of children isn't registered with the same GP as the mother and the children as well, and that complicates matters even further. Inconsistency at the front door of what is shared and what's not shared, and not getting a fuller picture of the family, the sorts of things that I've just talked about in the previous slides. Next slide, please. So again, there's some quite interesting data about how men can be excluded. So, for example, the points made here, fathers were only invited to child protection conferences just over half of the time. Known violent fathers not contacted by social workers just over a third of the time. There are 30,000 cases where men were involved in more than one lot of care proceedings. So again, that's about the history. You know, have you got other children, etc., etc. We could be seeing a father, I suppose, and just not recognising the risk history there. And only 68% of completed assessments involved fathers. Next slide, please. So the research did recommend a 4-tier model. This isn't my research and it's not my 4-tier model, but I think it's quite interesting to look at what the research was saying. So right at the bottom there, all the history that I keep going on about in these slides is understanding men's lives and their experiences. So their ideas of fatherhood, what their personal histories were of being parented, and race and ethnicity, all of that sort of detail, really significant. And then engaging and assessing men, looking at parental strategies, understanding their knowledge of child development. It's a really difficult thing if you've never parented a child before, and back to understanding their life and their experience, and that would be particularly significant for children and young people who've had a care experience and have had a lot of deprivation in their histories. That's not to say they wouldn't be good parents. We've probably all worked with young parents and care leavers who've worked very well, but it's about that risk, and it's about the need for the support, and then supporting best practice. So again, the supervision and first line management of workers, exploring fear and anxiety, and the quality assurance of those things, and then service design right there at the top, the culture and context, the tools and the frameworks of what is being used. But as I say, that's the 4-tier model that was a result of the research. Next slide, please. So the review in itself recommended that all the safeguarding partners looked at local strategies and action plans and improved practice and responses. So I've just highlighted the culture and context. So that's about how health visitings commissioned and links with other services, the expectations about working with men, and the support when working with violence and aggression, the processes, the linking up of services, the response to the Domestic Abuse Act 2021, and then the tools and the frameworks. So, you know, it's not just one thing, it's a whole system there. And as I say, that it wasn't that they were giving answers, but they were giving recommendations in that piece of research. Sorry, there's a lot of information on there. Okay, thank you. So this is the conclusions. So there can be, you know, terrible and sometimes fatal injuries on babies that have been inflicted by men in the past, but they are responsible for their actions and need to be held accountable for them. But our knowledge and involvement with men is often weak, and sometimes there's no involvement. Work with mothers tends to be much more nuanced and balanced and sophisticated, which I think is probably true. And yet there are men who want to be involved as fathers and express difficulties, that they're not seen and not heard and not included. And I think that we can all kind of relate to that. And also, I'm thinking about ICON really, and also what's happened with the sickness and the lockdown and all the rest of it in the last couple of years, that actually when we're talking about crying, sleeplessness, parenting, we give a lot of those messages to women and repeatedly give them to women, but we don't necessarily talk to men about it or talk in detail about how they manage those things. So we're trying to target more information at men, but it's how effective that is, and are they listened to in the way in which clearly the fathers in this research were saying they weren't listened to. I think there's a quote in the research that talks about how all the questions were focused on the mother in the situation, and the father in his head was going, well, she's giving you all the answers you want, but actually that's not what it's like as soon as you leave. It's really awful. So I think it was that feeling that they were disempowered from actually saying what was going on. Next slide, please. So, like we said before, some men want to be involved, others want to actually get away from their paternal duties, and they do present a risk to babies. and often seek invisibility or just be absent. So it's the entirety of the system, from the universal provision, because like the statistics were saying that almost half, practically half of those cases, there was just universal services going in, up to the specialist child protection agencies about working with fathers, that there are inadequacies there. So the other message from that research was the men aren't invisible, they're unseen. Okay, thanks. Next slide, please. So this was just a summary of the research. Obviously, we haven't got all the answers, but one of the key things in engaging men, but helping men to explore and understand fatherhood, particularly the good resources that we have about the first 1001 days and normal child development, helping understand, for example, about crying is a communication and what is normal for a baby, which they may not know, and all of the resources that we have locally, like ICON, DadPad. We haven't got that yet, but the perinatal mental health service are paying for DadPad, and that will be in place. So that is a particular resource specifically for dads, linked into lots of things that are probably more accessible to fathers and men than they have had other resources before. It's particularly been well thought out. Healthy Together resources, Home Start, all of those resources that we've got in LLR that could be available to men and maybe they don't know about. Thanks for the information that's coming through. So key questions for practitioners that were pulled out of the research. I've just pulled these together. Recording the names and dates of births of fathers or male carers in the household, or who visit the household or in a relationship with the birth parent, so that we've got a holistic view. And that's not about being negative. It's also about being, what are the positive skills and talents of the fathers available, and where can we support them? So it's understanding who's moving in and out of that household, and you know, actually making more effort to understand that, what relationship that father or male carer has with the child or children. You know, it's helpful to understand that, and it's helpful to understand, again, whether they could have support and what their knowledge is. It's not all about things being negative and risk. It could be really positive things. What kind of role that person takes in the life of the child. Are they taking them to services? Are they involved in, you know, looking after them overnight, that kind of thing? What experience they have of caring for children? Could they be given more help with that? Sources of support as well in caring roles. So again, grandparents, uncles, aunts, grandfathers, sisters and friends. As I've said before several times, the history of the father of the male carer, and I guess amassing some sort of idea of risk there, and whether there are things that need to be addressed, you know, quite importantly, quite high up on the list, and also health and well-being issues. So things like mental health and drug and alcohol misuse. And again, probably women, when they're expectant, mothers and women generally, are probably asked a lot more about their health history, and usually attend GP practices more. So we know more in depth about those sorts of things and histories, and they're asked those questions, but fathers often aren't asked those questions. The context as well, really important, like I talked about earlier, in terms of finances and housing, etc., etc. And then sharing that background information to other services. Next slide, please. So again, this is sort of part of the research, but again, just summarising those things. So planning for men involving fathers and male carers. Sorry, I just keep getting pop-ups. And non-birth parents in the services that are available. Again, often the messages are targeted at women and not targeted, and targeted at birth mothers as well, and not targeted at other people. Planning things with services with men, involving men in parenting assessments, and inviting carers and non-birth parents to case conferences, and then management and supervision of staff around the anxiety, and any implications for training, quality assurance, like I've said before, and service design.
I'm Liz Dunn. I'm the Safeguarding Learning Project Development Officer for the Safeguarding Children Partnerships across Leicestershire and Rutland. Helen introduced me earlier, and I've just come to talk to you about two sort of updates that we've had in our procedures. One is the threshold for access to services, and the other is practice guidance supporting children and young people who self-harm and or have suicidal thoughts. This is actually an action from a child safeguarding practice review, a local child safeguarding practice review. And what that action is that we should share information about the thresholds and practice guidance in an event like this in a safeguarding matter. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. And the reason that action's in this safeguarding practice review is because there's concerns that people A, don't know about them, and B, aren't reading them. So that's what I'm hoping to encourage you to do by just giving you a quick flavour of what they're about. So the first one is a threshold for access to services for children and families in Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland. And you can see that the links at the top of the slide on the right hand side. So when you get the slide, you'll be able to go straight through to access the threshold for access to services. It's across Leicester, Leicestershire and Rutland for the Safeguarding Children Partnerships. And this is the main premise of the threshold document. These are the 4 tiers. These are the thresholds in this sort of windscreen that we have here, windscreen rainbow. We like to call it all different things. And you can see we've got tier 1. So tier 1 are those children that grow up just using regular universal services. They have no additional needs, so they go to school, they attend their GP, they go to clubs, they have no additional support needs. And in fact, if this diagram was correct in terms of where that green line should go, it'd go right round into tier 4. So most children grow up in tier 1 in universal services. And then we have tier 2, requiring early intervention, children with some additional needs. So it may be that they need some support with speech and language. It may be that there's some behavioural issues and that can be managed in school. So it's just a little bit of support that's required. They have some additional needs and it can be met by a service quite easily. And then they can meet their milestones and they can thrive. Then we go up to tier 3. So tier 3 is requiring targeted and enhanced support, children with multiple needs becoming more complex. So this is where we might, there might be several needs that the child has. There may be some worries about things that are recurring frequently. There might be that something's been extended for a period of time. And it would be that we would want a sort of a team around the family type of approach. So we'd have a group of professionals working together to support this child and this family. And all of those are pre-statutory, so they're before we get into the actual statutory intervention, which is tier 4. So tier 4 is where we have our smallest number of children, actually, because it's very, very few children that sit in tier 4, but it's where they have acute needs. So they'd need specialist services, they'd have complex needs, where they're vulnerable, and there'd be perhaps more than one intervention required to respond to risk of abuse or neglect. So this is the high end, this is the acute end of the tiers that we have in tier 4. And like I said, that would be a very, very thin slither of our population of children. And you can see that there's arrows on the diagram as well. So the arrows go up and they go down. So it might be that you're concerned about a family, you think actually there is a risk of abuse or neglect, or you think they're experiencing abuse or neglect. You make a referral in, it comes in at tier 4, but in fact with some interventions, with some support, perhaps for a child in need plan or other support, it might move they might move along the threshold down into tier 3 or into tier 2 potentially. So people can move up and down the thresholds. They don't stay in one place. And what you also need to know is that if you're working in perhaps a universal service in a school and you make a referral because you're concerned and it's going up the tiers and you're concerned about that, you may still be involved in that child's life. You may be involved in the assessment, you may be involved in the support that's offered to that family, because you're not handing it over. So it's not that you make a referral in and it's, oh, that's it, it's your turn now, it's the end of my, that's not how it works. We all work together. We work together to safeguard children. And so you may be involved if it goes up to tier 4, and you may be involved if it moves back down as well. So we work together to safeguard children, and you might actually be the person or the people who've got the best relationship with the child or the family in order to support the work that's being done, the interventions that are happening. So that is the different types of assessed needs and levels of intervention. And so it's so that we provide the right support at the right time. And the next couple of slides are just exactly what I've just said. So they're in the pack, so that they're there for you, but they're taken from the threshold of assessment. They're taken from the document. I've not made these up, that, you know, it's directly from the document. So if you want to know, go and look at the document. And also in our threshold document, we have a brilliant appendix at the end. And this has this chart table of different ways that we think some needs are shown. So this is from the parenting factors part of it, and I know you can't read it properly, it's just to demonstrate what it looks like. So it has 4 headings at the top: universal, additional, targeted, specialist. Goes across the 4 tiers, and then it talks about, so if parents and carers can generally provide good care, meet the child's safety, physical and protection needs, we don't have any concerns. That's it. They're living in universal services. If there's high levels of domestic abuse that puts a child or unborn baby at risk, this is where it comes up into tier 4, and you can see that there's different levels of that along there. And there are actually 3 different appendices. One covers child factors across the 4 tiers, one covers parenting factors across the 4 tiers, and the other covers family and environmental factors across the 4 tiers. And you can see that they meet the assessment triangle, that, you know, they're in line with the assessment triangle. And then at the bottom of each of those tables is what you should do. So if what you're seeing sits in tier 3, for example, then you would complete an early help assessment with the family. If concerns escalate, seek advice from agency or your safeguarding lead. Consider completing a MARF, a multi-agency referral form. So that helps you in what to do. And then there's yet another table that tells you what types of services sit in the tiers. But like I said, just because you might sit in an early help type of service in perhaps tier 2 or tier 3 doesn't mean you won't be involved if there's some child protection issues. You may in fact be the best people to do that. So I just wanted to highlight that document to you. And it's really easy to read, it's very accessible, so I would urge you to go and read that. And if you're ever making a referral, you would need to read that document, and it's accessible from the pages where you might make the referral anyway. Right, so the second document I need to just highlight to you is Practice Guidance, Supporting Children and Young People Who Self-Harm and/or Have Suicidal Thoughts. So this is guidance that sits under a procedure. So it's in the resource part of the LLR, Leicestershire and Rutland procedures. So what the contents of what we have here are, yeah, I couldn't do it justice in this session because I've only got a few minutes. So I'm just going to tell you what's in it. So obviously there's an introduction, and then there's the principles of the approach. This document has been pulled together by a group of people across all agencies in Leicestershire and Rutland, and the key main agencies involved in this type of work. And what they've put as their principles of their approach are building strong relationships with children, young people and their families, saying that practitioners should understand their role and are curious to find out about how they can help children and young people. Practitioners having confident conversations with children and young people and really listening to what they're telling them. Working with children, young people, parents, carers to build strong support networks, improves resilience and informs safety plans to reduce risk. Timely intervention to get better support and understanding consent. Consent's a big issue, isn't it, where in safeguarding work. Promoting multi-agency working across agencies to make the best use of expertise and skills, even when this may be supporting more specialist mental health treatment. So again, if we think back to the tiers, it's not that handing over. We don't hand over mental health problems to specialist mental health workers. We're still involved. We might still be involved, even though it is something that needs specialist mental health, we might still be involved. And understanding the impact on staff well-being and providing support and training. Those principles are principles that should apply to all safeguarding training. Sorry, all safeguarding work. You see where I'm coming to. So this is something that I have in all my training. This is how we should work with children and families anyway. So the principles in that way are ones that should be familiar to us, really. And then if we carry on through this document, it tells us about self-harm. It talks about being curious. Again, that's an area that we know that we're not always good at being curious. We're not always good at asking those questions that we think are difficult or challenging. And then it talks about how you can understand the risk of self-harm and suicide. So it tells you about that. It tells you what some of the risks are and how you should respond. And then actually in that section 5, there's actually a flow chart for low risk, moderate risk and high risk, telling you what you should do, supporting you in how you should respond. It talks about understanding consent. So like I said, that can be an issue that worries us, but it talks quite clearly about when and how you should gain consent or why you might need it, how you might provide ongoing support. So it might be that a referral is made into a specialist mental health service, but how do you provide ongoing support? If it's a crisis, what would you do in that situation? How you get further help. It talks about what training there is available for practitioners, and there are sessions available across Leicestershire, Rutland around mental health issues. And then it has a list of resources as well. It has Appendix 1, which is an example, examples of questions to ask children and young people when considering the next steps. So some really useful practical tips on how to work with children and young people. Do's and don'ts, really helpful sort of top tips document. And then Appendix 2 is about a safety plan. So that's something, if you're working with a young person, a child or young person, you might be able to fill in with them. And then that gives you a point of reference for the next time when you're working with them, or when they might have a crisis, for example. Okay, so that's the end of my delivery. Is anybody, I'll hand over to you, Helen, to continue with the session and go on to the next session. So I'll stop sharing.
Okay, thanks, Liz. This really is a whistle-stop tour of some of the new procedures and updated procedures and things that have recently come out as a result of learning from our reviews and audits.
And thank you for inviting me today. I'm Alison Taylor-Prout, the designated professional for safeguarding adults at Leicestershire and Rutland ICB, which is the Integrated Care Board. I think I've got some acronyms in here, so don't be shy to tell me if I have. So today I'm here to tell you Nigel's story. Now, this is learning from a safeguarding adult review, and I haven't got long, so I won't spend a lot of time talking about safeguarding adult reviews and why we do them and the law around that, because you can have a look at the map if you're interested. Basically, we do a safeguarding adult review if we're worried that an adult has experienced significant harm or death as a result of abuse or neglect. And it's bringing a multi-agency together to see if there is any learning from that case. And this is what we did in this case. So I'm going to introduce you to Nigel and talk you through the learning that we had as a multi-agency. Now, what's important to just say here is that within the multi-agency, there's been in recent years, nationally and in our area, there's been lots of concerns about the human rights and well-being of adults with a learning disability. And this has played out through COVID, as we've seen increased deaths from adults with a learning disability. And this is what's happened in this case. Nigel died during COVID as a result of COVID, but also associated health problems. So this story is about the death of a young person, a young man, and it is a very sad story and reflective of other stories. So if it does make you feel uncomfortable or sad, do debrief with somebody and talk it through, because these stories are sad. But I'm not here today to talk about shame and blame and criticism. This is about learning and getting us all to think about, through a story process, what life was like for Nigel, and how we can see someone like Nigel more clearly, how we can hear them and how we can place them at the centre. And then really today it's about your personal reflections around generating your own personal actions from Nigel's story that will inform you in your practice. So it's really about personal reflection through a story. Thanks, Helen. So Helen's going to play a recording now of that was made by the reviewer. I can't take the credit for this absolutely amazing idea that she had. And rather than writing down who he was, she put it into a voice recording. So we'll let Nigel be introduced through this voice.
Can I just say that if people need to turn up their own volume,
Yeah,
it is quite faint, so people will have to turn up their own volume. Okay. Hopefully.
COVID pandemic particularly difficult. It against milk.
Sorry, I'm going to start at
I'm
the
very messy
beginning.
when I eat, so hello everyone. My name is Nigel, and I am 36 years old. I suffer cerebral palsy and have a severe learning disability. I live at home with my mum and dad. I cannot walk or move around on my own, but I can use a wheelchair. My mum and dad use a hoist at home to move me, and I have a stairlift to get upstairs. My home. I cannot attend my own personal care, go to the toilet or feed myself. To communicate, I use a kind of sign language, but it isn't a recognized sign, so few people can understand what I want. When I want something, I cough, to get people's attention. I do have an electronic tablet to help me to communicate, but I don't like to use it. It has pictures of things like feelings, food options and timetable choices. Although I struggle to communicate, I am aware of what is being said around me. I get upset if anyone shouts, and I don't like loud noises. I easily get anxious. It helps if I am reassured. I attend a daycare center every day during the week. I have done this ever since I left school. I like to make the other people there laugh. One way I do this is by making a mess. I find it really funny to tip the art and craft materials all over the table. I love how everyone starts to laugh with me. When I was younger, I used to take my brakes off my wheelchair when no one was looking. I would shout as I rolled away, and everyone would panic and run after me. That made me laugh too. I have a lot of difficulty eating and drinking, but I love the hot chocolate I always get when I arrive at daycare. I get a big cup full, but to help me, staff pour it into my smaller cup in small amounts. I have my lunch at daycare. I don't like lumps in food, but I like mashed up frozen vegetables, with grated cheese, and mashed potato. I like to have this with something like bolognese, or mashed up fish cakes. For dessert, I love mashed up sponge pudding, with custard and condensed milk. I'm very messy when I eat, so after lunch the staff help me get clean, and then I go and play on the computer with a bowl of crisps and a Kit Kat. I have to be reminded to keep sipping my drink. I don't like changes to my routine, so I found the COVID pandemic particularly difficult. It meant that sometimes I couldn't go to daycare, and when I did, I often had to sit on my own because of the risk of infection. And less people came to chat and play with me. When people did come to me, they couldn't come close. It was different to how it used to be. I also missed going to cafes with mum and dad, and going on holiday. It all stopped because of COVID. I like to eat at the daycare center, and I like to eat at cafes, but I don't like to eat at home. A few years ago, people around me discussed whether I should have a feeding tube to help me as I am very underweight, but my mum and dad were scared that I might pull the tube out, and so didn't agree. I have special shakes to try and help me to put on weight, and I mostly like those. I have one every afternoon at daycare, but in November 2020, I started to struggle getting fluid up a straw and could only manage a small amount of fluid a day. Then in December 2020, I got a pressure sore on my hip. It was really sore, and because I can't move on my own, there wasn't anything I could do when it hurt. My mum and dad didn't want a nurse coming to the house to dress it, so I went to a nurse at the doctor's surgery instead. It made me wince when anyone touched it. We got told that I needed a new bed, and a cushion for my wheelchair, to take pressure off the sore. But these things took ages to be delivered to our house. When the bed did come, on the 29th of December, I couldn't use it straight away, as it needed adjusting. My sore kept getting worse. It wasn't all bad over Christmas though. I did get to see Santa Claus. He and Mrs. Claus came to see me and gave me a present. It made me really happy and I gave him a big smile. By January I felt really poorly. My mum and dad took me to daycare, but I was crying because I felt so bad, and couldn't tell the people around me how I felt. I couldn't eat anything. I couldn't swallow. I was shaking. I am around 5 foot 10 inches tall, but I only weighed about 5 stone. I say about, because people had to guess my weight. No one had the right equipment to weigh me. The staff at daycare phoned my mum and dad. They were going to call 111, but my mum said her and dad would come for me, and take me to the doctor. I went home and my doctor's surgery arranged for someone to come and see how I was. But I was really poorly, and I passed away the following day, in the early evening.
Thanks, Helen. I've heard this lots of times, and I've worked on the review, and it never ceases to make, I always feel sad listening to it. It never stops being sad. And what I want to stress again is it was the perfect storm. We had COVID, the day centre had to close, everybody was struggling. And that would include the family, professionals, and Nigel himself. But when the day centre had to close, he was really unwell, and family hadn't liked professionals coming in. So this slide talks about some of the issues that interfaced with his care, that and a really good structure had been put in place to work with the family, to engage the family, and put Nigel at the centre. But what happened as a result was that there were times when his care was compromised, and this is because his parents loved him and cared for him without question, but they didn't always understand the law and processes around the law in terms of MCA and Care Act, because it didn't seem like it was explained to them and reiterated to them. And I don't think professionals always understood the MCA very well, and how that interfaced with his day-to-day life, and when that crisis occurred as well, people were trying to work, but by then, you know, he's saying here his BMI was very low, it was 9. And for people who don't work in health, that's very, very low, very emaciated. He was 6 foot tall, you know, and that contributed to poor physical health. He wasn't getting food and nutrition. Sorry, I've just seen my colleague put MCA, mental capacity assessment. Keep pulling me up. So he didn't get equipment that he needed at times, and it wasn't in a timely way, and this might have contributed to a pressure ulcer. He wasn't eating and drinking properly. There was a structure in place that was probably not keeping him as well as it could have been, but it was working to some extent. But when that structure was lost, professionals didn't have a relationship where they could get into the home and see him in the home when he needed that urgent care and treatment. And if they were invited in, they came, but there were times where staff were criticised and they were worried about complaints, and they pulled away from asserting his care being the centre of the decision making around his weight, around his food and fluid intake, and around what should be done. So what happened was Nigel ended up not having community nursing. He ended up having care delivered in a practice, a GP practice, and that wasn't the right care for him at that time. And because people didn't understand that bigger picture, no one knew his full story, and he became very malnourished and uncomfortable. Thanks, Helen. So one of the important things here is that he became an adult in 1992, I think, according to my maths, but certainly in the early 90s. And what there's been work locally around My Adult Still My Child, and I've put the link in the presentation because work was done there around transitioning young people with disabilities into adult services, because we know that transitions are a really challenging time for everyone. It's stressful, different services, but also different laws apply to children as they do to adults, and 16 plus for the Mental Capacity Act. And what can happen is parents who've always advocated for their child and worked in a certain way, their child with complex needs becomes an adult, and that can be really difficult. And what happened here is the parents have got the conflicting emotions, they want their family life, they want their adult child to thrive in the way they believe is right, and there's nothing wrong with that. But then what can happen is legal frameworks aren't applied to the person as an adult, and people struggle to do that. So I've seen this recently in a case where an adult parent is doing their best for an adult child, but it's not working and health's deteriorating, and it's just us all understanding this so we can have these conversations and explain to parents about the law and about how we have to work with adults and put them at the centre. Yes, thank you. Somebody's put that it should be considered prior to 16. Yes, it should. So again, it's this website's really good. It applies to the transitions group, but I think anybody working with adults with disabilities who live within a family setting, it's really helpful. Thank you, Gary. So it's really important to explain the law to carers and adults and also colleagues. So I did this recently, and I wouldn't say it was an easy conversation for anyone, but I spoke to a group of professionals about understanding the Mental Capacity Act, how it interfaces with the Care Act, and how we need to work with a family to put the person at the centre. So it's just everybody making sure we understand that. And if we don't, or we're not sure, that's okay too, because we all need help and advice at times. Go to your organisation's MCA lead or safeguarding team, or get advice from somebody that you can access to help advise you around this. Thank you, Helen. So one of the things was that Nigel had a really good communication passport, but when things moved into crisis, people were focused on getting urgent care and treatment to him, and tensions were building, and it was a difficult situation anyway. But his communication strategies weren't weren't central to communication with him and his family, and this meant that his voice was not always heard, and attempts weren't made to complete mental capacity assessments and work with him. And so it's just about remembering communication passports, asking if somebody has one so people can explain to you the best communication strategies, try and involve the person and support the person to communicate and give them the best chance to express their views where possible. Thanks, Helen. Okay, so we've done several reviews around learning disabilities in LLR, so Leicestershire and Rutland, and the LEADER programme, which is a national programme around learning from the deaths of adults with learning disability and autism. Now, this has come about in recognition that this patient group suffers inequalities as a result within healthcare and are likely to die a lot younger than the general population. So this process works alongside us in safeguarding, and certainly Susie from Leicester LEADER worked with me around this case, and we're looking to tell more stories to help learning. But one of the things that's come out from this case and others is this concept of diagnostic overshadowing. So diagnostic overshadowing happens when a health professional, instead of exploring biological factors, mistakenly makes an assumption that the behaviour of a person with learning disabilities is a characteristic of their disability, rather than recognising it as a way of expressing pain or distress. And researchers have highlighted that it is particularly pertinent when new behaviours develop or existing ones increase. Now, in the local cases, what we've seen is some real concerns around people's food and fluid intake, and what's causing this, and whether it's a change in behaviour in response to environmental stresses or changes, or whether it's to do with a physical ailment. And what we need to do is make sure that we consider all factors, and care planning factors in an understanding of diagnostic overshadowing where possible. And where possible, we think about it to mitigate those risks. So has the person had all the tests they require? Have they been weighed? And if we can't weigh them for whatever reasons, because that's also been an issue, how are we monitoring their weight so that we all are assured that we're getting the accurate weights? Because in Nigel's case, we didn't know his weight. We couldn't get him to a place where he could be weighed, but there are also other strategies. For example, community nurses in a housebound person, because they would have provided him a service if they could have, they can monitor weight by measuring arm circumference and observational skills. So they've got specialist skills and knowledge. So it isn't always about getting someone weighed, it's about working with their individual care needs to make sure that we understand and know whatever we can. Thank you, Helen. So something that I'm really interested in personally is being aware of your own unconscious biases. And I think obviously if they're unconscious, it can be quite difficult. So a presentation like this is just about encouraging us to reflect on our biases. So I've had to reflect and think, gosh, if I was somebody having to go into that really challenging situation, would I have thought about a communication passport? What would I have done? And how would I have put Nigel or someone else at the centre in those discussions? Would I have been prepared to have difficult conversations? And I'm not one to shy away from difficult conversations, as my friends and family would testify, but I think it's just making sure that we feel prepared and equipped to have those difficult conversations. And getting support, really. I think we all have unconscious biases, and it's just having that personal reflection, you know, with those who know you well, and that might be your clinical supervisor or your manager or whoever. So just lessening those impacts of those unconscious biases. So getting advice from your safeguarding team, using safeguarding thresholds, just to break down what concerns look like. And certainly in a case where a relative was challenging me around some of the decision making I was making a long time ago, I brought the MCA code of practice to the meeting sat down with him and I went through the relevant parts and explained that it wasn't me making decisions and choices. It was about just letting him understand the law, and it helped him. He was very distressed and very, very upset and worried about his family member. So it's about being compassionate as well to yourself, in terms of we all collect biases, and just working around them. And again, that supervision. I love supervision. I'll get supervision from anyone if they'll give it to me. And I love discussing cases. And I know when we're busy, it doesn't always seem realistic, but it's so important. There's a saying, isn't there? Or certainly a saying that I'm aware of. If you think you're too busy to meditate, you need to meditate. So one of the important things is using the escalation process. That's on the map. And if you're not sure what to do, talk to your manager or talk to somebody in safeguarding or a leadership role in your organisation who can guide you with that. So learning from the deaths of adults with a learning disability, and that includes Nigel, rather than doing this at the front end and then getting into policy and process, I wanted to just do it at the end and create that personal story first. So the voice of Nigel was unheard. The Mental Capacity Act was not appropriately applied. There is a concern that there was diagnostic overshadowing at times in this case. Essential care wasn't provided, and that's because there were barriers and challenges. And that led to safeguarding concerns not being identified and raised, and then that prevented a really clear chronology being established and shared as an understanding in the multi-agency. And then opportunities, again, that's linked to escalate concerns were not taken. And I must say, certainly, having worked in safeguarding quite a long time now, these themes are repeated often. So it is just important we stop and think and try and do something differently. Thanks, Helen. So just here, this is up to you. You might, go away and give no further thought to this, but just in terms of making a difference, think about any pledges that you'd like to make to yourself, share them in supervision if you want to, and just reflect on how you could try and make a difference in these scenarios. And it might be just being open to that respectful professional challenge. It might be challenging a situation that you're a bit nervous about. And none of us get things right all the time. It's just being open. So certainly that's my reflection at the moment for my personal pledges around this. Yeah, and just a reiteration, I'm really passionate about supporting people's human rights. So when we're talking about safeguarding, when we're talking about difficult conversations, what we're doing is we're supporting human rights, and we all benefit from human rights, and the people that use our services and the families, they're no different. Yeah, so the links are here just in terms of some of the extras, that you might want to read if you're interested. I know today it's going to be in the press, but the learning from the review into Wharton Hall, which is the learning disability assessment treatment units, come out. So, that might be in the press. And again, it's an opportunity to just place this vulnerable group of people in our thoughts and think how we can make a difference.
Oh, thanks, Alison. Thanks very much.
Thanks for inviting me.
For that presentation. Just to say that this Nigel's particular case will be, the review will be published, we think, in the second or third week in February, so watch out for that.
Good morning, everybody. So my name's Javiria. Everybody calls me Jav in Leicestershire Fire and Rescue Service, and I'm the safeguarding officer for the fire service. So I do a variety of things in the service. I manage cases when firefighters go to an incident and they've been made aware of an issue from, let's say, a property fire or somebody that's had a fall. They will make the relevant referrals, and then it's my duty to make sure that I'm following up on those cases with our multi-agencies. So what I want to do is just give you a brief, just a brief introduction really on what the fire service do and how you as multi-agency professionals can possibly help us to enable the service user to get the best service. And just tell you about our services that we offer and what to look out for when you go into people's properties. So The minimum criteria is what we ask for smoke alarms is to have one per floor. So if you've got 3 floors, ground floor, first floor, second floor, you should have a smoke alarm on each floor. And ideally they should be placed where your exit routes are. They should be on the ceiling covering each exit route per floor. So hallways and landings are the ideal places where we should really see smoke alarms. And another thing that we always advise, and this is from all emergency services, is to try to encourage service users to have a phone in their bedroom. That's one thing that we're not seeing. And that's because if there's an emergency at night time, they need to make sure that they have contact with the outside world effectively to get some help. In addition to that, what we also ask is if you do go into property and you've realised that exit routes are not clear, just look out for which exit routes are not clear. Is there only one exit route that's clear? And try to encourage the services to make sure that they've got exit routes in various ways. Keys accessible at all times to front door, back door, window keys in every room as well, so that, you know, if they were ever trapped in their own home, there is a way for them to get out. Now, having a fire plan as well. So I am rushing through this, and if I am going quickly, I'm ever so sorry. I've just got a lot to get through and I'm conscious of the time. We also encourage people to have a fire plan in their homes as well. So children at schools, they're very good. Everybody knows what to do if there was a fire at school, what the fire drill is. And it's equally important that at home, everybody knows what to do. And that's for people from all walks of life. So, you know, if their mobility is restricted, what they may have to consider is having you know, a stay put policy in their home in a particular room with having the door closed. And one of the best advice that I've ever, you know, in the fire service I've heard, and it's been consistent ever since I've been in the service, is to ensure that all your doors are closed when you go to bed at night. And if there's one door that we ask for you to close, that's your kitchen door, because most accidental fires start in your kitchen. Now, this is the basic advice that we offer to people, and we are conscious that everybody's lifestyles are different, but these are just certain things that we're asking you as professionals to look out for. And equally, it's for, you know, your loved ones as well that may be vulnerable, that you could hopefully embed into their daily routine. Thanks, Helen. If we could move on to the next slide. So I will talk to you about how you can make referrals at the end of the presentation, but that's just to give you an idea of just generic fire safety. So if we increase the risk now, and let's say that as a professional you've been told that there's an arson threat, so let's say the common denominators are unfortunately ex-partners or an immediate family member, and a threat has been made to say that they're going to burn down the house, fire-related threats, it's really, really important that you let the fire service know. And that's and the way you make that referral is through our normal fire service pathway referral that we have online. And we would ask that you do try to follow that up with a phone call, because the office hours are 9 to 5 and sometimes referrals are not looked at, let's say, straight away. So we just want to make sure that we are picking up those high risk referrals straight away. And the number to call would be the number that's on the screen here. Now, if it was out of hours, please also make sure that you do still call this number. And the reason that we ask is because we do have out of hours. And what we do is when we receive a referral, we've got 24 hours as a service to make sure that contact is made with that vulnerable person where that threat has been made. We will go and do a home safety check, and we will fit smoke alarms, additional smoke alarms if need be, depending on the home and, you know, the way that the house is set. If there's other exit routes, we will give advice as well, because normally our advice would be to leave the property if ever there was a fire. However, we're aware that the perpetrator may be outside, so it's about making sure that the individual is safe. The police would need to be reported as well, and the police are always very, very good at making sure that they alert us, and we do work very closely with them. But it's just if ever you come, you know, if you're made aware that there is an arson threat, please ensure that you do get in contact with the fire service. If you're unsure, ring up the number for further advice, and we can always, it may not be done within 24 hours, it may be done within the next 2 or 3 days, but I guess let us make that decision if we need to go out straight away. Thank you, Helen. So now I'm going to be talking about hoarding, and hoarding is a very, very big issue. I guess I guess for all services. So only in 2013 was it declared that it's a mental health problem, and for the fire service this is a very, very big problem. Now this is a photo of a house that resulted in 2 deaths, and it resulted in 2 people dying over the age of 70, and they were hoarders. Multi-agencies were involved. Luckily, they were involved. So what happened is, as a fire service, this was in Liverpool, so not in Leicester. They were alerted by the environmental health, and that was due to neighbours just reporting infestation around this particular house. They reported it to the fire service, and multi-agency work was conducted at this property prior to this fire starting. 2 to 3 attempts were made, and unfortunately they were unsuccessful. It was all recorded and logged, and luckily for them, you know, they did keep their records up to date, because this case ended up in the coroner's. So if you wouldn't mind moving over to the next slide, Helen. Helen?
Yes, I've moved it. Has it not come up on your screen?
Oh, it's not come up on mine. I don't know if it's come up on anybody else's.
It's a burning house.
Yeah.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So this was really, I'm just trying to give you an insight really as to what the fire service had to go through. Now, we didn't know anything on this. Yes, we made attempts, but because no successful entry was made, we didn't have any information as to how significant the risk was. So with the window just above the door, you can see clutter actually coming out of this one particular house. And this incident went on for a very, very long time. So the fire, you know, we tried to contain the fire, what Liverpool did. Merseyside Fire and Rescue tried to contain this fire, and it went on to the early hours of the night to try to put out this fire. Unfortunately, nobody survived in this fire, and it resulted, like I said, going to coroners. So I guess what I'm trying to reiterate is that as a fire service, we promote multi-agency working, and we do try to do every visit in relation to hoarders that are high risk with another worker, with another professional, only because learning outcomes from previous incidents have resulted that, you know, we don't really work collaboratively together, and that's not just from the fire service, but that's collectively as an umbrella service that we do. And if you ever do, please get in contact with the fire service so that we can try to help the service user. So if we move on to the next slide then, Helen, if that's okay. Now, this is a clutter rating image, and this is used nationwide. It's used nationally, and we do try to ask all professionals to use this to help us and yourselves to identify the risk level. So if we look at the first 1, 2, 3 where the photos are, that's green, and that's just showing you basically that there's really very little risk there. And we don't really need to report anything as of yet. However, there may be other fire risks, like if you look at picture 3, for example, you may see burn marks in the property, or you may see excessive alcohol bottles in this one property. So a referral may need to be made to the fire service because we're worried about the burn marks and the alcohol drinking, and potentially there could be a fire, and the evidence there suggesting that the burn marks are a clue, an indicator for us to make a referral to the fire service. If we look at the middle section then of this, and we can see that now it turns into amber, so it's starting to become on borderline, and where we're starting to get a little bit concerned now about the way that this particular person may be living, and it's just trying to give you I guess an image of what you should be looking out for. And this is on the borderline, so if ever you do come across this, please once again put a referral through to the fire service, because it may potentially start to get worse, and we need to try to get in there as soon as possible, from stopping it to getting very, very, you know, to stop it from getting even worse. And then the bottom, as you can see, that's probably the worst that we have. And if it's floor to ceiling, That's, you know, it cannot get any worse than that. And that's when we need to start thinking, well, are exit routes blocked? Would they be able to get out if they had a fall? Are there potential for them to have a fall in this house? If emergency services went in, would they be able to extradite the patient out of this one property? So if you haven't got this, handouts will be going out. Please print this out and just keep it on you so that when you are in a property, you can refer to this. And when you do refer into the fire service, just if you can typically give just, you know, identified hoarding, clutter rating image was 6 or 5 or 7, and that just helps us as a service to paint a picture for the particular case that you've identified. Now, when we looked at the bottom 3, automatically, if it's 7 plus, so the numbers are at the bottom of each picture, if it's 7 or above, it is a safeguarding issue and we need to report it straight away. Please try to report it as soon as you can, and a referral should generally be made to adult social care, the fire service, and if it's a housing property, then we need to alert housing as well. And that's where, as all services, we do try to encourage multi-agency work, because housing have a lot more enforcement, and adult social care, or, you know, there may be mental health issues involved in that they may need additional help. And from a fire service point of view, well, we can just advise and guide them on the reasons why we need to encourage them to have a safer way of living. If you wouldn't mind moving on to the next slide, Helen, if that's okay.
Done it.
Okay. So what we do as a fire service then, if we have a hoarding case, we review each case on a 3 to 6 months basis. And the reason why we do that is because the hoarding level may increase, it may decrease, there may be additional help that they require. And that just sometimes means that we liaise with our partner agency, or that we actually do a physical visit in that property because the occupier may not be engaging with the services very well. And it may be that they may, you know, want additional help now just because the circumstances may have changed. And also, as a fire service, it's really, really important. This just echoes the reasons why. So if ever there's an incident with a domestic fire, we normally just send out 2 fire engines. But if it's a hoarding case, 7 and above, we result in sending out 3 fire engines because of the clutter being intense, and that meaning that the fire loading is there and the risk being greater. And as a fire service, we have this written down on our turnout sheet. So when firefighters go to a property, the risk would come up, so they are aware of the property being fire loading high, and they would possibly have the clutter rating image so that they would be aware of what they are going into. So if you do come across a hoarder that is 7 plus, please ensure that we are referring into the fire service. Now, my duty as a safeguarding officer is to ensure that I work alongside multi-agencies. So I also attend, and we're talking about acronyms now, but I will tell you what this VARMS is: Vulnerable Action Adult Risk Matrix. And they're meetings that we have as multi-agencies to find where there's a risk to their life potentially, and we work collectively, set ourselves objectives to hopefully enhance and improve the service user's life. And I'm sorry, Helen, if I'm giving away your clues, but the MDTs are what we also attend, and that's where there's no risk to life. So I won't give away what it stands for, but you know,
You can say. Yeah.
So it's multidisciplinary team, and that's where there's no risk to life, but we've got concerns for the family or the way that they're living. And as multi-agencies, we're all coming together to find ways that we can try to work with the family, work with each other to try to improve their quality of life once again. Thank you, Helen. Now, what we've recently started in the fire service is a hoarding peer group, because we identified that there wasn't really much support for people that hoard. Now, it's very, very new, and as a fire service we're learning, and as other professionals we're learning as well. And what we do is we meet on the last Wednesday of every month, and we meet at a station in the city. So currently we're meeting at the fire station on Lancaster Road. And what we have there is we have a social worker from the city who's a specialist hoarding social worker, and from the county there's a team that are called Safer Spaces that specialise working with hoarders as well. So we have a member from their team attend as well, and we just have like refreshments, tea, coffee, biscuits. So we're going to be meeting next week, with an exception of not being the last month, just not being the last Wednesday because of Christmas, but we're just going to have mince pies, biscuits, and for people, I guess, that hoard, just to network with one another and just so that they can, I guess, meet other people that hoard. It's all well and good as a service, us meeting them, but they need to, I guess, be able to talk to people that live a similar lifestyle to them. So far it's going well, and if you do have anybody that you know that would love to come to this, please get in contact with them. Myself, and the email will be at the end to refer in, and we can hopefully communicate with yourselves as to best practice to get them in. Thank you, Helen. So very quickly, because I'm just conscious of the time. Now, as a fire service, we run a programme called Fire Care, and this is a programme for young fire setters up to the age of 18. So it's a free confidential service, and this is for young people that have been identified as fire setting. And it may be due to curiosity, it may be due to peer pressure, whatever may be the reason. But please, you know, refer them into the fire service. We do need parental consent, as we can't do the service if we've not given consent. However, if we don't get parental consent, what we can do is we can come into schools with the permission from the schools, and we can educate the whole group just about the dangers of fire setting as well. Numerous sessions of this would be held, and it could be at the home or at school, and followed by that we also do a home safety check at their home, and it may result in additional smoke alarms being fit just because of the risk level being fairly high. If we could have the next slide, please, Helen. And this is I just wanted to give you what the service page looks like, so what our page looks like. And if you log on to Leicestershire Fire and Rescue Service, if you go under safety, this is the referral pathways that you could use. So for a home safety check, it would go under at home. And if there's somebody that's fire setting, you would go under youth and kids. And at home is the referral that you would make for an arson threat being made as well. So that's just giving you an idea, but please, just to reiterate, if there was an arson threat, please try to make sure that we are making those referrals followed by a phone call as well. And then the final slide is my contact details. And this just gives you my name, my email address, and the safeguarding inbox. The fire service details, contact details are on our webpage should you need to gain further information. I hope that's helped. I'm very sorry it's brief. I'm just conscious that we finish in 3 minutes, so I just wanted to pass it over to Helen. Thank you.
Okay. Oh, Jav, thanks very much. Yeah, it's really, really interesting. And as we keep saying, you know, if people fill out the evaluation form and give us their email address, then all of this information will be sent out to them. So so thanks very much for that. Just 2 minutes, I think I've got, just to let you know that there is a slide there around multi-agency safeguarding adult learning that is available. Go on to our YouTube website. That's really good. 1 or 2 videos there that people might find interesting. A Tricky Friends video actually, just an update, we're actually getting that done in the Ukrainian language. So you know, because obviously concerned about people coming from Ukraine and being exploited. So that will be out soon. Then we have a slide for multi-agency safeguarding children training. So again, some interesting things coming up there. Impact of parental imprisonment on prisoners' children, and again a link to the website. So okay, so I'm afraid we're not going to have time to go all through the acronyms, but I'll just let you know that we have a list of all the acronyms there. one, I don't know how well people think they did, but yeah, we've actually mentioned one or two things as we've gone along through the presentation today. So hopefully people know that they're MDTs and multidisciplinary team meetings. And I was going to just say that parental responsibility, make sure that health colleagues may have another definition for PR per rectum, so be careful you don't get your parental responsibilities mixed up with your per rectum. So that on that lovely note, I am going to stop sharing if I can. There we go, I'm back. Okay, well, thank you so much for attending. It's been great that people have stuck around, and it will be lovely to see you again in the future. So watch this space for information coming out of the next event. The Safeguarding Matters publication will be out in March, so watch for that. And thank you very much.